Molly learns a lesson, a school story. This is a continuation of Chapter 4, Spies and Allies. Look who I found, Mrs. Hargate called to Allison in a very loud voice as she shook off her coat. Darling Linda, Susan, and Molly were waiting outside. Take off those sopping coats, girls, and the boots, too. Why, Molly, aren't those boots a teensy bit too big for you? Scoot along now. Go on in, join the party. I'll be in the den if you need me. Molly, Linda, and Susan bumped into one another, each trying to be the last one to enter the living room. Allison jumped up from the circle and said, "Hi!" "Hi," mumbled Linda, Susan, and Molly. "We were afraid you weren't coming," said Allison. "Where are your knitting needles and yarn?" She looked behind them as if they might be hiding yarn and needles like there as a surprise. "Oh, we don't have any," said Linda. "Oh, well, it doesn't matter," said Allison. "I have lots of extra needles, and none of us has used very much yarn yet. Sit down, and I'll get everything for you." Molly, Linda, and Susan sat awkwardly on the edge of the couch behind the circle of knitters. They looked like three crows on a branch. "Here," Allison said as she handed them needles and yarn. "I hope the colors are okay, and I hope you're good knitters. We sure need some. How come you're so late?" Linda looked at Molly. Molly looked at Susan. Susan twisted a strand of yarn around her finger. "Well," she said, "we're not doing knitting. I mean, we have another project where—" Molly jabbed Susan with her elbow, and Susan stopped talking. Allison looked puzzled. "You're not making socks? You have another Linda hand project?" Molly took a deep breath. "We're sort of just visiting you. We're doing a different project." "What is it?" asked Allison. "It's a secret," said Molly. "Oh." Allison went back to knitting. Molly, Linda, and Susan just watched. The other girls knitted silently. Molly noticed that none of the knitters had gotten very far. Most of the girls had knitted only the top part of one sock. They were just getting to the hard part, the heel. Where they needed to use 3 needles. What they had knitted didn't look at all like socks. They had knitted squares about the size of a doll's blanket. A blanket! Molly sat up on the edge of the couch. That's what they should knit, not socks. They could knit squares, then sew them together to make a big blanket. They practically had enough squares already. A blanket was such a good idea. So much easier than socks, and so much faster, but Molly didn't dare say anything. After all, it wasn't her project. Suddenly, Grace Littlefield threw down her needles. She looked ready to cry. Everyone stared at her. "I can't do this," she wailed. "I just can't. It was hard enough with 2 needles, but 3 is impossible. Every stitch I knit comes undone. I'll never make a whole sock, ever." Molly felt sorry for Grace. She slid off the couch and sat on the floor next to her. "Socks are hard, Grace," she said. "But you have a nice square here. If you all put your squares together, you could make a really nice blanket. I saw Mrs. Guilford do it once. See, you just lay out the squares." "We're making socks," said Allison. Molly sat back upon the couch. "Wait a minute," said one of the girls. "Maybe Molly has a good idea. We all have squares already. If we all just make 1 or 2 more, we could make a big blanket." "How do we sew the squares together?" asked Allison. "Oh, I know how to do that," said Linda. "You don't have to be able to knit to do that. You just need a big sewing needle." "Oh, let's try it," said Grace. "A blanket is a good idea." Molly jumped up. "We should have an assembly line," she said. "The best knitters keep knitting. Grace, you collect the squares and flatten them out. Linda, you and I will sew the squares together." "I'll finish your square, Grace," said Susan. "I'll go find a big sewing needle," said Allison. All of a sudden, everyone was talking at once. The knitters clicked away on their needles, finishing square after square. Grace hurried from knitter to knitter, collecting, flattening, and organizing the finished squares. Molly and Linda sat up on the couch. Linda sewed the brightly colored squares together into long strips, and Molly sewed the strips together. Slowly, the knitted blanket grew until Molly had to drape it over the back of the couch. Finally, the needles were still. All of the girls stood up, lifted the blanket to fold it. Susan held one edge up to her cheek. I think this is the most beautiful blanket anyone ever made in the whole world. And we all did it. I don't even remember which squares I made now, and they're all together. Now that they're all together, said Allison. But do you think a blanket can win the lend a hand contest? Asked Mary Lou Dobbs. Is a blanket a good war effort? Oh, yes, said Molly. Her fingers were sore where she had pricked them with the needles, and her legs were stiff from sitting still so long. Just this week, we got a letter from my dad saying that they really need blankets in the hospitals. It gets pretty cold in England, and winter is coming soon. Just think, said Allison, this blanket may keep some poor wounded soldier warm. It may save his life, Linda added. All the girls looked at the blanket again. I'm sure it will win a prize, said Molly. The girls folded the blanket as carefully as if it were a flag. I'll wrap it in paper so it won't get dirty on the way to school, said Allison. She turned to Molly. A blanket was a good idea, Molly. We couldn't have done it without you. Are you sure? I mean, what about your other project? Could we all help you with that? Molly looked down at her feet. It isn't such a great project, she said. Not like the blanket. And we weren't doing it too well anyway, said Linda. What was it? Asked Grace. Susan, Molly, and Linda looked at each other, and they all smiled. Oh, it was terrible, said Susan. We were collecting bottle tops for scrap metal, and we knocked on everybody's door. It was so hard. We only got 16, and then we decided to come over here and come over and see what you were doing. Collecting bottle tops is a good project, said Allison. I'll go ask my mother if she has any. If we all ask our mothers, we can get pretty many, said another girl. We wanted to get 100, said Linda. You know what, said Grace. Her face was shiny and excited. I live in an apartment building. There are 20 families in my building. We can ask all of them. I bet we'll get 100 bottle tops easily. Yes, and we won't get wet, laughed Molly. Let's go. We only need 78 more, said Allison. My mother had 6. She put the bottle tops on Molly's school bag. Molly smiled at her. Thanks, Allison, she said. Allison smiled too. With the flurry of buckling, zipping, buttoning, and tying, the 10 girls got into their raincoats, boots, and rain hats. They set off for Grace's apartment building. As they splashed down the wet street, laughing and talking and planning, Molly decided that some secrets are a lot more fun when you give them away than when you keep them. This one shows a article from the newspaper. It says, 3rd grade girls win the Lend a Hand contest. 10 students at Willow Street School showed the true meaning of Allied effort this weekend. The 3rd grade girls won first prize in the school's contest to help the war effort. They knitted a blanket and collected 100 bottle tops, which they made into a sign saying, Lend a Hand. Both projects were a surprise to me, said their teacher. I don't know how the girls managed to finish them in one day. I'm very proud of every one of the girls. At a school assembly today, each girl was given a blue ribbon. The blanket will be sent to a hospital in England where Dr. James McIntyre, the father of Molly McIntyre, is working with the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The bottle tops will be given to the Boy Scouts scrap metal drive.